Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Ely Cathedral on behalf of the Dean and my colleagues in chapter. For this 13th annual Amnesty International Lecture, as many of you will know, the lectures are named in honour of their instigator, Ben Jupp, who was in 2009 one of the founder members of the Ely Amnesty Group. And the group itself meets, as also you may know, but if you don't, good to know, at St. Peter's Church Hall in Broad Street at 7 o'clock on the first Tuesday of every month. And I am assured that you'll receive a very warm welcome if you were to turn up and join them. Amnesty relies on the fundraising and awareness raising of local groups. And although this evening's event is free, if you wish to make a donation, there will be a collection at the end, which will go towards Amnesty International's human rights work. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Laurie Bristow was the last UK ambassador to Afghanistan during the fall of the Republic to the Taliban in 2021. He was the UK's ambassador to Russia from 2016 to 2020, and to Azerbaijan from 2004 to 2007. Senior roles in London included Director for Eastern Europe and Central Asia and Director for National Security. Laurie has been President of Hughes Hall, Cambridge University since October 2022. And he's recently published his book, Kabul, The Final Call, the inside story of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, August 2021. So please do welcome him most warmly.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation this evening. This is a truly splendid, wonderful building, and I hope that I'll be able to do some justice to the setting in the talk that I'll give this evening. I'll start with a very, very short slideshow. They are images taken during the evacuation from Kabul in 2021. Most of them were taken by my friends Jimmy Langan and Ben Shred, the military communications people in Kabul airport, documenting the withdrawal. Some of them were simply taken on iPhones by members of my staff. They are very carefully selected for reasons I'm sure you will understand. None of them, I hope, will be too distressing, but of course the subject matter itself is distressing. And I just wanted to let you know that. So if you want to look away, please do. The slideshow takes probably a minute or two. So I'll just run through it in silence. Have a technical hitch. Okay, I'll leave that one up there because in a way, that picture pretty much tells the entire story that I'm about to talk about. That soldier, by the way, is a member of the UK's parachute regiment. That is just outside the gate of the Baron Hotel where we conducted the evacuation from. And about 100 meters behind that is the Abbey Gate. One of the entrances to the United States evacuation, of course, where the suicide attack took place just before the end of the evacuation. So I'll start with an extract from the book. It's the early hours of the 17th of August, 2021. I awoke with a start as someone knocked sharply on the metal door, opened it without waiting for an answer, and flicked on the bright ceiling light. The room was small and cold from the aircon. A moment of disorientation, then I remembered I was in Taipan, the British military base on the airfield at Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport. I felt dizzy and sick with lack of sleep. VHF radios crackled and beeped, crisp voices conveying urgent messages of information and instruction. I'd slept through all of that. It was Jason, one of my armed close protection team and a former soldier. He was polite but very insistent. We need to move you to a safer location immediately. He stepped back outside the room. I pulled on clothes, shoes, body armor, helmet, grab bag. I'd laid them out in a row across the floor of the room a couple of hours previously. in anticipation of a rapid move during the night. I pulled my phone and charger out of the wall socket and shoved them into the bag, along with the laptop and notebooks. Jason and Claire, another of my close protection team, were waiting outside the door, fully kitted up in body armor and helmets, carrying assault rifles. We headed out into the night, moving quickly and deliberately across the blacked-out compound. Other members of the close protection team appeared out of the darkness, forming a box with me in the middle. We moved deeper into the base, picking our way carefully in the darkness across concrete curbs and around deep potholes. I stubbed my toe on a random lump of concrete, unseen in the darkness. Through a gate in the chain-link fence and towards some low buildings, someone grabbed the handle on my backpack to steer me and to move things along. We broke into a brisk jog. Around us, soldiers with weapons and night vision equipment moved quickly, quietly, and with purpose. They were heading out, beyond the concrete walls and the relative safety of Taipan, onto the airfield. Later, as they came back in, it was all too clear that things were in a bad way. Out on the airfield was a vision of hell. Hordes of desperate people who would do anything to get out of Afghanistan. Gunfire and the beat of helicopter rotors as the military tried to move them off the runway and the taxiways. Smoke, flares, and searchlights lighting up the sky. It was around 2 a.m. We watched the scene unfolding on banks of TV screens, showing feeds from surveillance cameras and imagery from the huge blimp still keeping watch high over the sky, over Kabul, from news media and from social media. The airfield was overrun by thousands of desperate Afghans. There were people on the runway and in the taxiways, in the airport buildings. There were shooters among them. Who knew who or why? Military flights could no longer land or take off, so there was no way out of Kabul and no way in for the thousands of additional troops who would be needed to secure the airport. The next few hours would be critical. I was the last British ambassador to Afghanistan. The book is about the final months of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, about the final stages of the war the Taliban fought and won against that republic, and about the evacuation from Kabul in the last 2 weeks of August 2021. It's about the political and strategic failures that led to those events. I wrote it because what happened in Afghanistan in August 2021 was one of the defining strategic failures of our lifetimes. But it was and is also a human tragedy. Above all, for the soldiers and the civilians whose lives were lost or broken by the conflict, and for those left behind. The book is about real people, the people living the consequences of those strategic failures. Those consequences are at their starkest in what the Taliban are doing now to Afghanistan's girls and women. There is a move to characterize what the Taliban are doing as gender apartheid and to hold them to account for it. Those words do not begin to do justice to the deliberate and systematic exclusion of women and girls from all basic rights and freedoms. The right to work, to speak and to be heard, to make choices for themselves, to travel, to learn. Nor do they do justice to the physical and moral violence that enforce those exclusions. It's been my privilege to come to know some very courageous Afghan women, in particular people like Zara Joya, the founder of Afghanistan's all-women news agency, Rukhsana Media, which exists to tell the stories of Afghan women in their own voices. They do so from Afghanistan at huge personal risk and with unfathomable courage. I do not think that we can or should look away from what happened, why it happened, or the consequences of failure in Afghanistan. The UK government decided in 2021 that there will be no public inquiry into what happened. In the United States, partial and selective accounts have been published to try to make political capital and to deflect accountability ahead of November's election. A few days ago, a retired senior minister reminded me that public inquiries are not always an effective means of understanding why things go wrong and learning from them. He was right, but even so, we do need to understand what happened and why, otherwise we will not learn from it. The book is my personal attempt to make sense of what happened. It wasn't easy to write, and it's not meant to be easy to read. The best advice I had before starting was from the late Iraj Bagazadeh, the founder of IB Tauris, an expert on the Middle East and South Asia, The advice was just write it and then decide what to do with it. So I'll go back to 2001, why we went into Afghanistan. It was to suppress al-Qaeda after the 9/11 attacks against the United States. To achieve that, the United States and its allies removed al-Qaeda's Taliban hosts who'd refused to extradite them. The US and its allies then worked with an array of Afghan leaders to stand up processes to create a new, stable state that would never again host al-Qaeda. On the face of it, the new state, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, was to be pluralist, reflecting Afghanistan's extraordinary mosaic of ethnicities, languages, religions, and tribal loyalties, but only up to a point. The Taliban were initially to be offered no place in that new Afghanistan. This led inexorably into an insurgency war as the Taliban regrouped and tried to fight back. Over time, the US-led international coalition had multiple strategic objectives. These, of course, evolved over time. They included counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, countering narcotics, state building, development, support of democracy, the rule of law, basic rights for women and men. Some of these sought to address long-standing consequences of conflict, the Soviet invasion and occupation, the civil war that followed the Soviet withdrawal, and the intensely repressive Taliban administration that existed before 2001. Remember in all of this that Afghanistan was and still is one of the poorest countries on the planet. During the period before 2001, it was not so much a question of before 2021, it was not so much a question of fixing a failed state, but of creating a state in a country where a state had never even existed in any sense that we understood it. The rhetoric, of course, was that these processes were Afghan-led, but at the heart of this, some key questions remained unresolved to the end. Whether Afghanistan's politicians, warlords, and tribal leaders were prepared to subordinate their own interests and rivalries to building a coherent state. Whether the United States and its allies were capable of supporting the emergence of a state that was both stable and legitimate in the eyes of most Afghans, and whether the Taliban and their supporters, Afghans, not foreigners, could be brought into the fold. This process of state building had been underwritten for nearly 2 decades by a huge military commitment to support the Afghan state against a Taliban insurgency war. At the height of the so-called Obama surge in 2011, there were 130,000 coalition troops, foreign troops in Afghanistan. The US spent somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion, depending on what you count. The UK spent tens of billions. Thousands of Afghan civilians and soldiers from many countries died, among them 457 British soldiers. Meanwhile, the US-led invasion of Iraq took place in 2003. That war quickly went wrong, at huge cost to the influence of the United States and its allies. It was also an immense diversion of attention and resources away from Afghanistan at a critical time. Both conflicts came to be seen as quagmires, expensive, risky, and electorally unpopular legacy wars. It became increasingly difficult to explain to the public why we were still there. When I accepted the job of ambassador to Afghanistan in late 2020, someone close to me asked, "Why are we still there, and how are we going to get out?" A decade on from 9/11, the United States located and killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, in a compound in Pakistan, close to the main military academy, essentially the equivalent of Pakistan's Sandhurst. The US began to reduce its military presence and to hand over responsibility for security to Afghan forces. NATO combat operations in Afghanistan were to end by 2014, but that in itself would not create the conditions for lasting peace. There followed a decade where the focus was on building Afghan institutions, including Afghanistan's armed forces, supported by a so-called train and equip mission, NATO's Resolute Support Mission. In 2020 and 21, that too was being wound up and was to finish by summer 2021. The withdrawal of NATO Resolute Support Mission was intended to complete the withdrawal of all foreign forces from Afghanistan, apart from a small residual force of United States Marines, whose job would be to assure the security of the United States and Allied embassies in the Green Zone, the fortress-like city within a city at the heart of Kabul. The book starts with the Trump administration's February 2020 agreement with the Taliban that set in train that withdrawal, the Doha Agreement. To give it its full title, it's quite a mouthful, the agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan between the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which is not recognized by the United States as a state and is known as the Taliban, and the United States of America. You will notice that there is a missing piece in that heading. There is no involvement and no mention of the Republic of Afghanistan. In that agreement, the Trump administration set out its intention to withdraw all foreign military forces within 14 months. The Taliban agreed to begin talks with the internationally recognized government of Afghanistan about a political settlement. But the military withdrawal was not made conditional on this political process going anywhere. The Taliban, of course, slow-rolled the intra-Afghan negotiations, as they were known, and at the same time launched a full-blown military campaign to seize control of the country. As I said, the Doha Agreement was an agreement between the United States and the Taliban. The government of Afghanistan was not even invited to the negotiations between the United States and the Taliban and was not a party to the agreement. It was, though, required under the terms of the agreement to release 5,000 Taliban militants from prison as a down payment. Under pressure from the US, the Afghan government did so. Many of those Taliban former prisoners returned to the battlefield. Joe Biden became president in 2021. By this stage, the military withdrawal agreed by the Trump administration in February 2020 was nearing completion. President Biden had long been opposed to a continued US military presence in Afghanistan. There was a short review which concluded in mid-April, 14th of April. The Biden administration pressed ahead with the military withdrawal, and it was largely completed by the weekend of the 4th of July, the public holiday in 2021. It's just worth bearing in mind the wider context here. So the start of Mr. Biden's presidency was marred by the refusal of Mr. Trump and his supporters to accept that he'd lost the election, leading to the 6th January insurrection and the assault on the Capitol. Biden could have decided to pause the withdrawal from Afghanistan, as America's top generals repeatedly advised both Trump and Biden to do, and to make it clear to the Taliban that there would be no unconditional withdrawal without a political deal. But if he'd done so, with the almost certain likelihood of renewed Taliban attacks on US and other foreign forces, I think he would have been wide open to political attack from Trump for throwing away a pathway to ending the United States' longest war. The Taliban, meanwhile, intensified their military action. During the first half of 2021, they seized control of all of Afghanistan's main roads and border crossings. Despite a commitment to a reduction in violence, they killed over 700 politicians, journalists, and public figures after signing the Doha Agreement, in which they agreed to peace negotiations with the government. They neutralized the Afghan Air Force, not by shooting down the planes, they couldn't do that, but by turning up and assassinating the pilots in their homes. They conducted a highly effective propaganda campaign, inviting Afghan soldiers to surrender and posting on YouTube grisly videos of what happened to those who didn't surrender. They launched a rocket attack on the government as it gathered in prayer on the morning of Eid. The rockets passed directly over my embassy. My direction from London was to keep the embassy open once the military had left. For some years, Kabul had been the UK's biggest embassy, and by some distance, its most complex and expensive. By 2021, it was no longer the biggest, but I think still by some distance the most expensive. Its key task, after the withdrawal of the US, British and NATO forces, would be the same as it had been for the previous 20 years, since 9/11, to suppress the threat to the UK and its interests from al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, and in order to achieve that, to support the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan's political stability, its economic development and humanitarian needs, and its alignment, to the extent that was possible, with our values, in particular the rights of women and girls, in one of the world's poorest and most conflict-ridden countries. All of it, had been underwritten for 20 years by the military presence, which would be gone by the end of the summer 2021. Before leaving for Kabul in June 21, I led a transition task force in London, whose job was to identify and put in place the security and logistical support structures that we would need once the military had gone. I arrived in Kabul in mid-June, just in time to attend a flag-lowering ceremony at Kabul airport for the departure of the last British troops assigned to NATO's Resolute Support mission. We were still putting in place the arrangements that would replace them. Afghanistan's armed forces were collapsing even as the military withdrawal was still taking place. But the military withdrawal went ahead anyway. The holiday weekend of the 4th of July marked the closure of US operations at Bagram Air Base, the heart of the 20-year military campaign, this huge air base about 20-30 kilometers north of Kabul. It was handed over to Afghan forces, although in reality there was no formal handover. The Americans left in the night, and the Afghan commander discovered the next morning that they'd gone. The end came suddenly. The Taliban seized control of their first provincial capital on the 6th of August 2021. It was Zaranj, a border town close to the Iranian border. Other cities then fell to the Taliban in rapid succession. All of the main cities, one after the other. 9 days after the fall of Zaranj, the Taliban took Kabul and it was all over. The fall of Kabul itself happened on the 15th of August. Things, of course, were moving incredibly quickly. Efforts were still underway to negotiate an interim power-sharing agreement between the government and the Taliban, but that fell through when President Ghani fled the country on the afternoon of the 15th of August. So I'll put in here now another excerpt from the book. The date is the 15th of August 2021. President Ghani was still in the palace, where his staff posted videos of him pulling the levers of power. But the levers were attached to nothing, and his government was melting away. The ministers of defense and interior had been sacked a few days previously and could no longer be reached. Vice President Saleh had left for the Panjshir Valley, from where he would lead the armed resistance to the Taliban. A group of senior Afghan politicians made their way to the airport to fly to Islamabad, putting their hopes in the Pakistan government to broker a last-minute agreement with the Taliban, or maybe just to save themselves. Even now, there were divisions within the government, with Ghani reported to fear that this group of senior politicians were planning to cut him out of any future political settlement. In the early afternoon, I received reports that President Ghani was about to flee the palace and that 3 helicopters were being prepared. They took off with Ghani and a few of his closest officials around 2:30 p.m. A few hours later, the media reported that President Ghani and his closest advisors, Hamidullah Mohib and Fazl Fazli, had reached Uzbekistan. The plane load of ministers headed for Pakistan had taken off as well. I messaged London. TB, that's Taliban, are through the gate. Shortly afterwards, pictures appeared on social media of the Taliban gathered around Ghani's desk in the presidential palace, from which he'd broadcast to the nation a few hours before. Kabul had fallen. The Taliban had taken Kabul. I sent those messages to London from Taipan, the UK's military base at Kabul airport. A couple of days before that, the US and the UK had taken decisions to move substantial military forces back into Kabul in case an evacuation became necessary, only a matter of weeks after we'd completed the withdrawal of our forces. That deployment was in progress but not complete when Kabul fell to the Taliban. The decision to close our embassy, the UK embassy, was taken at the same time, a couple of days before the fall of Kabul. And the initial plan was to relocate a small team to the military base at the airport to organize the evacuation of Afghans and British nationals at highest risk. The emergency closure of this huge, complex embassy, about 130 buildings spread across 3 interconnected sites, was planned to take a week. In the event, the closure teams had 9 hours. On the 14th of August, the senior US military commander in Afghanistan warned that the Taliban could attack Kabul within the next 24 to 48 hours. If they mounted an attack on the airport during that time, we did not yet have enough soldiers in place to defend it. Their intentions were unknown. They'd fought their way to power and overthrown the government of Afghanistan, despite the commitments they'd made 18 months previously in the Doha Agreement to negotiate. Thousands of Taliban fighters were being let out of prisons as they were overrun. So were large numbers of Islamic State fighters and other extremists. One of those prisons was Pulicharki, a huge wheel-shaped facility that used to fly over on final approach to Kabul airport. One of my WhatsApp exchanges with Tom, a senior British military officer, reads as follows. This is me. Do we know how many Taliban in Pulicharki? 7,200 inmates, 3,186 are Taliban. You saw what happened next. Thousands of people desperate to leave Afghanistan converged on the airport, and the airport was overrun. There were not enough soldiers to secure the perimeter, and we lost control of the airfield and the runway. Aircraft were mobbed. There were people clinging to the sides of a plane and falling to their deaths as it took off. For 24 hours, everything hung in the balance. Only once the military had regained control of the runway were we able to get enough soldiers in to secure the airport and for the evacuation to begin. Flights restarted in the early morning. I'd managed to doze off and was woken by the noise of a C-17 transport planes, one of those huge four-engine jets, taking off a few hundred meters away. I checked in with the same military colleagues. You guys okay over there? Deprived of sleep. The clearance operation on the airfield last night was high stakes. I had about 2 hours of wondering whether it was going to end badly. As it stands, it's enabled us to secure the airfield and runway, get flights in with combat power to resolve the security perimeter issues. I replied, hats off to you guys. But I also needed to ask a straight question. Did we lose anyone and did we kill anyone? The answer was no to both. The UK military evacuation operation could now go ahead. It was named Operation Pitting. We'd planned that we might get out possibly 5,000 people. The team got out over 15,000 in under 2 weeks. It's a testament to the incredibly hard work of the evacuation team, military, diplomats, border force staff, and Ministry of Defence civilian staff in, of course, appalling and very dangerous conditions. The conditions in and around the airport deteriorated. It was intensely hot. As you know, children and old people were being killed in the crush. That evacuation was only possible because of an uneasy truce with the Taliban, the men that we had fought for 20 years. During the evacuation, our soldiers, the youngest of whom was 18 years old, were working within a few feet of armed Taliban. I just can't begin to describe the courageous restraint of those young soldiers and of their officers who kept control of such a tense and volatile situation. There were discussions about extending the evacuation beyond the end of August to get more people out. The Taliban leadership made it clear that any foreign forces still in Kabul after the end of August would be considered hostile. Meanwhile, an even bigger problem was brewing. We were starting to get intelligence of a terrorist attack being planned against the crowds at the airport. But there was no hard information where, when, or how such an attack would be carried out. It happened on the 26th of August. It was an Islamic State terrorist. The attack was conducted at the Abbey Gate, a few hundred meters back from that entrance at the Baron Hotel. About 170 Afghans and 13 US servicemen and women were killed in the final days of that 20-year campaign. The following morning, I attended the ramp ceremony, the loading of the coffins of the dead soldiers onto a plane for repatriation. For a moment, Kabul airport stopped. My diary entry for the 27th of August reads as follows. The whole 20-year campaign had taken on some awful symmetry, beginning and ending with innocent people's lives being taken away in acts of obscene violence. In that moment, outside the Abbey Gate, died any last hopes and illusions of the 20-year campaign to build a different kind of Afghanistan. It seemed that all that was left was fear, bigotry, violence, and chaos. How was it that the expenditure of so many lives, so much political capital, so many resources over so many years led to such lamentable outcomes? In my view, Trump's Doha deal is a strong contender for the title of worst deal in history. It set a timetable for the military to leave, but did not set any binding conditions for them to do so. In doing so, it removed any incentive on the Taliban to negotiate a political settlement, and it pulled the rug out from under the Afghan government and its armed forces. We are now seeing the consequences of that. But the Doha Agreement didn't come out of a clear blue sky. Successive US presidents, 4 of them, had been faced with the political imperative to end America's longest war, but none had found a path to the exit. Trump's decision to sign the Doha deal was driven, in my view, by pretty low political calculations. He wanted to go into the 2020 election as the man who brought the soldiers home, and he was unconcerned by the costs, which in any case will be borne by others. For Biden, determination to end the US military presence in Afghanistan was long-standing, and there was a more developed strategic rationale. In my view, that rationale was not entirely wrong. The United States' priorities had changed. It was necessary to refocus attention and resources elsewhere, and there was no reason to believe that carrying on doing the same things in Afghanistan would magically lead to different results. The failure of the 20-year campaign was not for want of resources. What was missing in all of this was a viable military exit strategy. We created a state and a military that were dependent on us, and they quickly collapsed when US and allied military left. In my view, this was not just the fatal flaw of the Doha Agreement, but the fundamental strategic failure of the whole 20-year campaign. The United States and its allies did not invest enough, early enough, in an inclusive political settlement that would have created the conditions for our military to leave. Afghanistan demonstrates very clearly that essentially political and societal questions cannot themselves be fixed by military means, and they may even be made worse. Afghanistan's underlying political and societal problems demanded the presence of foreign forces, but could not be solved by the presence of foreign forces. Those forces became part of the problem, whether they stayed or whether they left. In all that time, we hadn't created the conditions that would allow a safe withdrawal of those foreign military forces, but we did so anyway, because we had no better strategy despite 20 years of trying to find one. What happens now? The situation in Afghanistan is awful, and it's getting worse. Afghanistan and its people are in the grip of a major chronic humanitarian crisis. The causes are complex. Decades of conflict, drought, disease, corruption, poor governance. At least half the population needs humanitarian assistance. And we're seeing escalating repression, particularly but not only of women and girls, as a deliberate choice by Afghanistan's current rulers. In August this year, the Taliban passed a further decree which included a ban on women speaking in public or singing, described by the United Nations as the erasure of women from public life. These are deliberate decisions by the Taliban leadership, a defiant response by those rulers to efforts by the United Nations and members of the international community to persuade the Taliban to change their behavior if they want a path to international acceptance. Can Afghanistan ever move beyond those terrible days and their consequences that are now playing out? There are no easy solutions, and we have very limited leverage. Such leverage as we had largely melted away when the Taliban won their long war against the internationally recognized government and its supporters. And of course, there is no shortage of demand on the attention, resources, and political capital of foreign governments. The world is in a mess. So I'll offer a few thoughts about what we could, should, and should not do. First, we should not look away. We should not allow ourselves to believe that what happens in Afghanistan is no longer our problem. We went into Afghanistan in 2001 because the Taliban hosted violent people with the capability and the intent to attack us. The failure of the state we helped to build does not mean that that risk has gone away. The opposite, I think, is more likely. If the public is concerned by large numbers of Afghans and other refugees turning up on our shores in small boats, we need to ask ourselves why these people, leave their homes and eventually get into those small boats. Not everyone has a choice about that. People fleeing violence and oppression and poverty don't generally do so because they want to, they do so because they need to. This is an argument for seeing our humanitarian and development work as part of our national security, as well as reflecting our values. Second, if we learned nothing from Afghanistan and Iraq, or nothing else from Afghanistan and Iraq, it is that efforts to recreate very different societies in our own image are likely to fail with catastrophic results. Afghans themselves need to decide what future they want for their country. We cannot decide that for them, but we may be able to help where help is wanted, particularly in making space for those deprived of their voice to have their say. That's why I think it's very important to make space, particularly for Afghan women, to speak for themselves, a right that the Taliban denies them, but which literally everyone else has a duty to uphold. Third, patience and persistence. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. Most of what we achieved in that time was destroyed, but one thing wasn't. An entire generation of young Afghans who want something different for themselves and for their country than what they now have. It is possible to educate people. It is a lot harder to uneducate them. Fourth, and this is a more general point, it's about asking difficult questions. Why did we fail in Afghanistan, and what did we learn from that failure? What do we do with that knowledge bought at such appalling cost? The calamity of the Iraq invasion is very instructive. That decision and its consequences produced a vast industry of inquiries and recommendations. The most useful conclusions and recommendations that I've seen are the ones that say, ask difficult questions, keep asking them, especially if the answers don't make sense. My final point is for all of us, and it's something that Foreign Minister Hanif Atmar said to me in mid-2021, 1 month before the end of the Republic. It's this: repeating past mistakes will simply lead to the same results. We failed in Afghanistan. We need to understand that fact. We need to understand why we failed. We need to avoid repeating previous errors, and we need to come up with better ideas informed by what happened in August 2021. This is a pretty dark and troubling story, but I want to finish on a more positive note. A lot of this story is about individual people's courage, but it's also about friendship. Through the events I've talked about today, I've come to know some of the most courageous and principled people I have ever met. There's something about the bonds that you form with people in the most difficult and extreme circumstances. So I'll finish with a story about my last hour in Afghanistan, which gives a sense of that side of things. The time had come for me to leave Taipan and move across the runway to the military terminal. Some quick goodbyes and good lucks to the soldiers who'd been such a joy to work with in such a joyless time. And then we were on our way to a holding area in the military terminal. The rest of the team were already there, chatting or sleeping or staring into space in plastic garden chairs under awnings amidst a sea of rubbish. A friendly dog snuffled around, evidently part of the dispatch team who were putting together the passenger lists. With less than an hour to departure, it was time for me to do my last media clip. Andy McCoubry, one of my deputies, and I worked out what I was going to say and jotted down some notes. Ben and James, the military comms team, would do the filming. We quickly scoped out some possible locations, maybe not alongside the overflowing dumpsters and the wrecked vehicles or the increasingly tired-looking terminal buildings. It was a no-brainer, out there on the runway with a Royal Air Force plane in the background. There were half a dozen or more military transport planes parked up with the engines running. The noise was impressive. Ben and James set up the camera on a tripod at the edge of the taxiway, using a special directional microphone to minimize the background noise. It was hard not to squint in the blazing sunshine. Andy kept a tight hold of my sheet of notes, literally that, in case the wind grabbed it and whisked it away across the runway. There were some nervous giggles from the close protection team. We did the clip in one take. As we were filming, a couple of SUVs roared across the concrete apron. Heavily armed and heavily built US personnel demanded to know who we were and what we were doing. Maybe they put it a bit more assertively than that. Filming for social media, of course. What else would we be doing on a Saturday afternoon in Kabul airport? Have you met the British ambassador? Nice to meet you folks. You take care now. Thank you. I will take questions or comments from anybody who has any. Yeah, the lady, I think there's a microphone, possibly even a dog coming around.
I've lived in Asia, right over to China and Hong Kong way, but also I spent 10 years in the Gulf, 2000 to 2010, so I wasn't far from some of those incidents. But what I was going to ask you is it not clear that a Western mindset, like Mainland, will never understand an Islamic, an Asian mindset, and that we're fools to think that we can sort out their issues? And within that question also, how true is it, as you said at the beginning, that Afghanistan is such a mix of tribal groups that, how are they going to actually sort of issue out themselves because of their own interests and their conflicts?
Thank you. There are lots and lots of questions nested in there. Maybe to bring out a few of the key points of this. I mean, first of all, the question of trying to remake countries in our own image. So I was involved, as I just described, at the end of that campaign in Afghanistan. I was involved in the post-conflict planning for the Iraq invasion right at the beginning of that. And I think one of the things that we should have learned, whether we did is I think for others to judge, and by we I mean the UK, the US, our allies, the countries that we work with, is essentially how much do you understand about the country you're working in and with, and how far does your remit actually go? So of course there's a difference between Iraq and Afghanistan in that Afghanistan was triggered by the 9/11 events. Iraq was a policy decision, for better or worse. But I think the underlying question in each case is how far it makes sense, how far it's even legitimate to try to create a state through once you've intervened. This, I think, was the problem that we never really fully resolved in either case. And in terms of particularly dealing with the Taliban and the counterinsurgency war in Afghanistan, one of the things that we need to understand is, first of all, the Taliban they are Afghans. So you decide to include them or not include them in a political settlement, but they are Afghans, and they are capable of pulling a lot of people over to their side. So if you decide you're not going to include them in a settlement, you need to think through where that leads. If you decide you are going to include them in a settlement, that leads you into some fairly unpalatable decisions about who you're going to engage with and how you're going to maximize the chances of a reasonable outcome. My other point here is about time. So as a practical point, I mean, I'm a diplomat, not a theoretician of these things. In very broad terms, I think we left it far, far too late in Afghanistan to address that question. If your answer is that you have to bring the Taliban and their supporters or potential supporters in, the time to do that is early on and when they're weak, not late and when they're strong and you're under time pressure and they're not. This is negotiation 101. Maybe another point behind that as well. It's around how you do diplomacy. I mean, how people like me in the jobs that I did in the past, how you operate. Something I think I've learned the hard way is that you can never have too much knowledge about the country you're working in. It's very, very easy when working on pretty much any of the countries I've worked on to spend all your time talking to people who you like you, speak good English, and more or less agree with you. They may not be the people who are actually in charge of the place or the most influential people there, Russia was a pretty good case in point. I worked for many, many years on Russia. And if you believed at the time, if you believe now that pro-Western Democrats are the center of gravity in Russia, well, they're not. You know, a lot of this job is about dealing with people, understanding the motivations of people who are not like you, who fundamentally disagree with you and want different things. But if you don't understand that, you know, you're not going to make progress. Yeah, take another one. There's one in the middle over there.
Thank you so much for a really engaging talk. You spoke a lot, obviously, about how you've seen kind of this total loss of competition and as we're seeing a rapidly intensifying crisis in the Middle East as a whole, would you say the same is true for Britain's losses?
Yeah, I suspect there are a few questions in there. So first of all, with Afghanistan, the UK, the US, the West, we have lost most of the influence we had there, because most of that influence came through the government that we'd helped create and were working with. That government has gone. I mean, this is the hard reality that we're now dealing with. The international community has some leverage, but not very much. So without going into all of the details, the United Nations has convened a political process to try to engage the Taliban. A very senior Turkish diplomat, a man I knew in Ankara 25 years ago, Feridun Sinirlioglu, wrote a roadmap essentially back to not normalization, but back to some kind of new status quo with the Taliban, which they've studiously ignored. And they've ignored it because they can. This, I'm afraid, is the situation we're now in. So we are now faced with a big dilemma, which is how to support the people of Afghanistan, the 50% of the population who are in urgent humanitarian need, how we support Afghan girls who can't go to school. We're going to lose an entire generation of Afghan girls. And as Zara Joya once said, my journalist friend, if you're not educating girls, you're not educating boys either. So there are all these systemic issues here. But there's a very, very difficult choice there about how far you work with the Taliban, how far you try to ignore them, and how far you work against them, particularly when you don't have a presence in country. There's another point here as well, which we don't, I think, talk about enough, which is the non-West. So if you look at the geography of Afghanistan, the neighbors include Iran, Pakistan, China, and the former Soviet republics to the north. They all have interests. They are all difficult countries for us to deal with. Russia, I hardly need to explain. Iran, well, you touched on it. China, not a huge alignment of values there, but we do need to be asking, as a practical proposition, are there alignments of interest, even partial alignments of interest? If so, how do we work with them? If there are, if they're opposing interests, then we need to look at how we prevail, basically. But maybe to illustrate the point a bit more clearly, in the final months in Kabul, most conversations amongst the Western ambassadors tended to come back to two propositions. The Taliban will do what we want because, A, they want legitimacy and that's ours to confer, B, because we have money and they need it. They have never considered legitimacy to be ours to confer. They don't care whether we think they're legitimate or not. They won. And that's where their legitimacy comes from, conquest and Allah. Money, they'll do without it. They like it, but they'll happily do without it. And it's not the Taliban who pay the price of that. In the broader Middle East, well, we haven't really got all night. But I think one of the things that we are all struggling with now, with these multiple overlaid conflicts, it's not just one conflict, it's by my count at least a dozen going on there, is that quite often this isn't fundamentally about us. Sometimes it is, but maybe sometimes only peripherally. So if you're trying to get to a situation where, for example, in the Gaza conflict, I think most people would agree this conflict isn't going to come anywhere near de-escalating and resolving until the fighting stops and the hostages are released. It's evidently a precondition. People will stop fighting when they see more to gain than to lose from stopping fighting. This is the way it works. So at the moment, I think the incentives aren't there to do that. There may be things that we, more likely the Americans, can do to achieve that. But until those incentives change, until it makes more sense to talk than to fight, the fighting will continue. Yeah, down the back.
Hello, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. Mentioned something rather of another country. It was in 1997 I visited Myanmar. Very friendly people there, but it's, as you know, it's been under a military rule for a long time and still is. We're not hearing a lot about it now, except I understand there are groups fighting the military, and we don't hear anything about Aung San Suu Kyi, which she did so much, but it's all gone quiet. So as our message, this is a very dangerous place in the world now, very.
So Myanmar is not a country on which I have any expertise whatsoever, I have to say. A former colleague, a friend of mine, was Vicky Bowman, who of course was ambassador there. She's left the Foreign Service and of course was arrested and imprisoned for a while. Maybe the most useful thing I can just touch on very briefly, I did a little bit in the introductory remarks, was about the overall state of the world. So I was in New York a couple of weeks ago for the General Assembly week on college business. And it was the week, of course, General Assembly is when all of the heads of state and government come together and they have their moment, talking to the global audience in the UN building. The previous weekend was Antonio Guterres' Summit of the Future, the Secretary General's Summit of the Future. Of course, very, very positive, lots of things to talk about, lots of positive things that we all wanted to do. It's very, very important in these discussions not to lose sight of where we actually do want to get to. But I was really struck by how pessimistic his analysis of the world today is. There are multiple conflicts happening. The one I follow most closely, of course, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm a Russianist. We are all following the multiple overlaying conflicts in the Middle East. The one costing probably the most lives of all is in sub-Saharan Africa. Doesn't appear much in the media, and so on and so on and so on around the world. There is also an overarching problem here, which is that the institutions, what people like me until recently happily called the rules-based international order, is disintegrating around us. And at present, there is not much really to take its place. So what that all amounts to is, the world is in a more dangerous and volatile state than at any time I can remember in my adult life. We have not got the tools that we need to address that. There are, of course, this is the year of elections, half the global population going to the polls in one way or another. We're in a transitional period. What that means, of course, particularly in the way that the media works, is that some conflicts fall off the agenda. I'm afraid that's how it is in terms of public attention, but also the attention of policymakers. But I think it's always worth bringing this back to this. It's not about theoretical issues. You look at the faces in that picture, there are real people behind those conflicts. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the briefing. I think one thing that definitely learn from history is that you learn history.
Okay, thank you. As you reminded us, of course, the UK's history of Afghanistan doesn't go back 20 years. One of the things I think we managed to get it back, we were looking at in the embassy as we were doing this very, very fast closure, was a couple of small cannons that went back to, I think, the second Afghan war. So for those who know their history, that one didn't end well either. Some more general conclusions that I've drawn from this, but also from thinking about how we got from the optimism of 1989-91, the end of the Cold War, to where we are now. I joined the Foreign Office in 1990 as the Cold War was ending, and I left it a few months after Mr. Putin conducted his full-on invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So one of the things was already covered by the question over here. It's about the importance of actually understanding the motivations of the people you're dealing with. Sometimes it's called strategic empathy. I don't actually like the phrase because it's quite often misinterpreted, sometimes deliberately misinterpreted, as being an apologist, particularly when you're dealing with people who are fundamentally opposed to you, as of course we are with Vladimir Putin. But I think the underlying point is a good one. It's understanding why people do what they do, especially if it's not what we would do. And of course, I've spent much of my working life, or the last 20 years at least, studying Putin and his administration and trying to work out why they're doing it. If we don't understand that, we're not going to make good policy. To do that, you need to speak the languages, you need to know the country, you need to speak to people who disagree with you. My second point, I stumbled across this quotation a few days ago. It was Jung, I think, the philosopher. Judging is a lot easier than thinking. Again, you see this all the time. You see it in yourself. It's that sort of leaping to say I'm right and they're wrong, rather than thinking about why do they think what they think? Why do I think what I think? Am I right? And my other one, a bit related to both of those, I've done a lot of lecturing on this since leaving the Foreign Office. It's about what are known as cognitive biases. So broadly speaking, believing that the world is as you would like it to be, not as it is. So the events I was talking about earlier on, all through those last few months and weeks, we were coming up again and again against two things. One is confirmation bias, seeing what we want to see rather than what is actually happening. The other is optimism bias, believing things will go better than they're going to. That 9 days at the end, from the fall of Zaranj to the fall of Kabul, we talked a lot about a cascading collapse of Afghanistan. That's what a cascading collapse looks like. You don't want to believe it's happened, it's happening. You don't want to believe it's happened. But at some point, it fell to me to say to the government in London, it's over. Ghani has gone. This 20-year campaign is over. Now what? So I think being able to anticipate those kinds of moments, that's a really big part of what we're talking about here. Yeah, take one in here. Yeah.
How do you see the situation in Afghanistan changing?
Yeah. Time is always a factor, and one of the things I've repeatedly talked about in talks, training courses for younger diplomats and analysts is in this job, there is always a day after, always a day after. So you reach what you think is quite often called a new equilibrium, but then what? Then what happens? I don't see that change for the better will come to Afghanistan anytime soon because of the reasons why the collapse happened in 2021. The Taliban won. A lot of Afghans disagree with that, but they applied military violence until they won. That's what happened. There is, I think, essentially zero prospect, or I would say zero desirability, that Western forces would have another go at this. I mean, why on earth would we, having failed so badly for the previous 20 years? And I don't think the public would accept that, even if any government thought it was a good idea. What I hope will happen over time is a number of things pushing in a similar direction. One is that the center of gravity within the Taliban changes. So what you've got is not a monolithic movement. You've got, well, maybe go back a stage. There was a lot of talk in 2021 about a Taliban Mark II, a pragmatic, reformed Taliban. It was all nonsense. There was no evidence for it whatsoever, and we're now seeing that. What there was a group of politicians, political leaders, who might have been persuaded to be at least more pragmatic. Illustrate the point, I know for certain, because he said so to a colleague of mine, that there are senior Taliban politicians who send their own daughters to school, but in the Gulf, not in Afghanistan. The decisions, though, at the moment are largely made by the religious leadership in Kandahar. They're old men, there are other old men, and I don't think this changes quickly, but over time it's possible that there might be a rebalancing, particularly if we don't do stupid things in the meantime. And of course, the demographics are important. It's a very, very young country. Now, as our friend over here said, a lot of Afghans in exile. Many of them are in exile because they do not want to live under the Taliban. I just can't predict at this stage where or when change will come from. But we have to hope in that. And to come back to a point I made in my remarks, it's no good white men of a certain age like me saying what is good for Afghanistan. It needs to be Afghans saying that. And if you want a next speaker or a future speaker for your group, invite somebody like Zara Joya to come and say what she wants. She is the woman who set up this news agency. There are lots of people like her. We need to find ways of giving them voice and support and resources. But there are no easy ways forward. Yes, over here, I think.
Thank you very much. Is there any consensus, as far as we know, amongst the Taliban leadership, what they want for their country going forward?
Yeah.
Are they looking for universal acceptance as a nation?
Yeah. Not yet. First of all, as a nation, that's a problematic concept, I think, in Afghanistan. As I described it, there is an actual organization, an Afghan NGO that actually the leader of it lives in Cambridge, called Mosaic, and it's called that for a reason. It is this incredible mosaic of ethnicities, tribes, languages, religions. And the geographical boundaries around that, of course, are contested. Have you heard of the Durand Line? This is the line drawn by the British Empire between what's now Afghanistan and what's now Pakistan. All sorts of things going on in the mix there. So to describe it as a single nation or prospectively a single state, I think it doesn't really quite make sense in the sense that you or I would understand it. As to what they want, as with the previous question, I think it partly depends on who you ask. If you ask particularly the religious leadership in Kandahar, what they want is an extreme version of Sharia, as they understand it, overlaid, of course, with cultural factors as well. It's really not up for negotiation. So the thing about girls' education, they believe it is the wrong thing to do to educate girls. They believe it's the wrong thing to do to educate boys either, other than in a very narrow sense in madrasas. They're not going to change their view on that, but others in the movement might do so over time. But I don't want to finish on a wholly pessimistic note. So maybe the thing just to focus back on is both the age profile, the fact that there are a lot of, it's a very young society in the sense of a lot of young people, and also those Afghans in exile, some of them living in appalling conditions in Iran and Pakistan. Some of them made it into exile in the West and elsewhere. But they're out of Afghanistan for a reason, because they do not want to live under this very, very restrictive idea. What can the international community do about it? I think there's a part pragmatic answer. It's you can't watch people starve. you need to do what you can to stop that happening. And that sometimes requires some very, very difficult and distasteful compromises. But at the same time, you need to understand, we need to understand that there is a currency here. So I'm often asked, should the UK recognize the Taliban as a government? Well, my answer is no, not unless they pay for it. And the way that they should pay for it is by at least moderating their behavior. And then you get into a dialogue with them about how you might take the relationship forward. There's a much longer conversation, but maybe at least stop there.
Thank you so very much, Arkansas, for the informative and realistic assessment of the situation, and for your optimism as well. It's certainly a measure of optimism. And we're also grateful. Thank you to Ms. Well for organising the event. You have a table of books there, and I want to just remind you of that. So please do take advice on that issue. And also, let's have a thank you to you.
Thank you. Thank you once again for the invitation. I really hesitate to quote Italian Marxists in Ely Cathedral, but what you just said reminded me of Gramsci. It's the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. Thank you. Thank you. Sobering, I hope. But,